Hey, what is going on? It is me, and it is Friday, February 4th, 2022. And as we are still in the early days of February, it's probably a good idea to take a slight detour from what we've been doing. Um, and mostly what I've been doing, well, it's slight detour I may go back to, but what I've been doing is going into cellular neurology, right? And it's very important in cellular neurology to understand how the different cells of the brain work on an elemental level, how they're organized in terms of the neurons and glial cells and oligodendrocytes and astrocytes and microglia and parasites, even at the astrocytic foot processes, all that stuff that we've talked about already. I think it's important to know that, and in learning those elemental pieces of the brain's cellular structure, it gives you sort of, or it's given me a sort of a better way to understand the actual larger structures of the brain, like the larger organizational level. The issue is the brain is, and I'm talking about the brain so much, I'm going to jump around because this is just all about neurology. But I'm talking a lot about the brain now because, I mean, I've decided my eternal life studies need to focus on the, at least in the short term, the aspect of consciousness, because I can have the goal, and I've had the goal of understanding eternal life from the biochemical perspective, which makes sense, but just in case, and that's the most intriguing aspect to me. But consciousness is, in its own right, a very intriguing study and an intriguing phenomenon, and it depends on. I mean, it is life itself, right? Life and awareness. The issue is preserving eternal life or preserving consciousness, or being able to do either in case one isn't in case the biochemical path is truly insurmountable, right? Or the obstacles in front of the biochemical path to extending life are insurmountable, then we need to go into consciousness preservation. So it's worthwhile from that sense understanding that, and also because a lot of what goes on in diseases of life that are related to health extension are neurological in nature, right? Like, for example, Alzheimer's disease and things like that. So it definitely helps to understand both aspects and all the aspects, right? So I just wanted to say I'm not going to go into the entire body, by the way. I'm just going to stick to very specific parts that allow me to advance my studies in this area of life extension and health extension. So and that's why the brain is part of that. So let's start with the brain itself. The brain, biggest, one of the most power hungry organs in the body, and the most important organ in the body, really, right? Because it controls everything, the brain and the spinal cord. So it's a lot to start with because the brain is obviously super complicated, right? Your and sometimes I found it hard to focus in on how I want to start studying the brain, and I might again revisit these lectures as I may revisit my lectures on the immune system from a cleaner perspective and more chemically organized perspective. But as far as the brain is concerned, we might as well start with the telencephalon or cerebrum, which is describing the large portion of the brain that everybody's the most aware of, that consists of these fissures and these sulci and gyri, right? These folds, these folded areas. So the telencephalon is basically it's where all the functional aspects of thought reside. And I've recently heard that people consider the telencephalon itself all of consciousness, right? Consciousness is distributed through the different pieces of the telencephalon, right? So it's called the cerebrum too. One thing that's I found in studying brain structures like the telencephalon and cerebrum, there's words that have similar meaning that are thrown about interchangeably, right? So people think of cerebrum, neocortex, isocortex, cerebral cortex, telencephalon, right? So the thing is, it's important to really over the course of the study, I found so far to dissect these terms and to categorize them appropriately, but know what's analogous to other terms, right? And so a lot of this is basic knowledge too, right? People know that the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain in red, and it contains central hemispheres. So if you divide the brain in two, you've probably seen pictures of a brain divided in two, right, from the top portion. So I believe this top view is the superior view of the brain. There's another term for it, but this superior view of the brain. And then, like, if you look at the brain from the side, I'm just going to make a quick detour. If you look at the brain from the side, it's the sagittal view of the brain right here. So basically, when they dissect the brain through the middle and you look at the side view, this is the sagittal cut was made, which gives you this this view of the brains, all the brain structures from inside to out, down to the central structures of the brain. Right, so some horror movies have had quite a bit of fun with sagittal cuts. But let's go back to the other parts of the brain. So you have your cerebral hemispheres, which contain your cerebral cortex and underlying structures below, subcortical structures. So everything inside the brain itself that you can't see is a subcortical structure. The cortexes are outside, and the cortex is outside, and it's divided into these lobes, right? So now let's talk about there's different ways to descend into the brain, right? So the outermost layer of the brain is called the neocortex, okay? The neocortex is basically the most developed part of the brain. It's the gray matter. It's gray matter which surrounds and by gray matter it means the neural cell bodies, like the somas of your neurons and such, right? And other support cells like astrocytes, but it's mostly neurons, right? And then below that is the allocortex, which consists of white matter, which is glial cells, and or myelinated axons, right? So the cells, remember the myelin is colored white. It's the fatty part of the brain, which allows signal transduction more effectively through the axons. Okay, so anyway, the neocortex is where all of reasoning occurs in the brain, and it's pretty much surrounds the entire top of the brain, right? So a good way to visualize this is from the side. So this is the cerebral cortex, right? So if you divide the brain, again, if you slice this brain this way, I have to remember what all the different slicing is. But this violet purple part here is the cerebral cortex, and that's the division of that is into the neocortex and allocortex. Okay, so now if we go into the lobes of the brain, and obviously there's so much to talk about with the neocortex, right? It's a very complicated organizational structure, and if we talk about the different lobes of the brain, that's important to know because these lobes are functionally segregated, right? So again, the frontal lobe, the front part of your brain, right, is responsible for your personality. So if you know about the Phineas Gage experiments and all the classical experiments with destruction of the frontal lobe, which caused personality shifts, and thereby the way that people learned about the frontal lobe's function when people were studying the brain earlier in the century, right? The parietal lobe and temporal lobe, your parietal lobe is your general sensory lobe. So pretty much all the sensory stimuli that you might encounter, and this doesn't mean like a visual or auditory stimulus. This means things like touch, your temperature sensitivity. So all your basic inputs, they're processed at the parietal lobes, and we'll get that back into that specifically later on. And then your temporal lobes are essentially what handles your smell, your sense of smell. So your temporal lobes are at the side of your brain, underneath your parietal lobe. Your occipital lobe handles vision. It's all the way at the back of your brain, and temporal lobes also handle auditory information. And then inside your brain, you have your insular lobe. I believe that's not visible without looking into the brain. So you can kind of see it. Well, I guess I don't know if you can really see it, but that insular lobe controls taste, right? So we were talking about something neat to remember. We were talking about the blood-brain barrier before, and there's certain regions of the blood-brain barrier which the blood-brain barrier generally prevents entry of substances into your brain space uh, that don't have a certain, that aren't controlled, that aren't similar, that are not simple lipid soluble molecules like O2 and CO2, and etc. But there are parts of your brain which don't have a blood-brain barrier, which need to be exposed directly to your bloodstream for the purposes of your brain actually being able to make assessments about your blood. For example, one of those, and in your insular lobe, there's regions. I don't remember what off the top of my head what they are, but they are responsible for sampling your blood to determine the saltiness or the sugar level, right? So that's essentially similar to how the taste element occurs in your body, but it's complicated because there's that insular lobe has taste processing elements in it as well. So other things to talk about in the brain, which we'll get to also, are the differences between the sulci and the gyri, right? So the below the lobes, an organizational structure, by the way, we should talk about other types of visible structures in the brain. Throughout the central section that divides your two brain hemispheres, you have your longitudinal fissure, which is positioned where the corpus callosum is positioned across, which the corpus callosum divides, is the connecting tissue between the two parts of your two hemispheres of your brain, your left and right. And people used to treat epilepsy, fun fact, by cutting the corpus callosum, but by doing that, in many ways, similar to how a lobotomy failed, people, cutting the corpus callosum had many side effects as well, where, for example, somebody one time who had their corpus callosum cut was asked what they wanted to be when they grow up. They should write it, and while they were thinking firemen, they wrote down police officer. So yeah, cutting, these things are like, ancient relics of a barbaric pre-surgical or early surgical heyday. But I guess maybe it's still being done, I don't know. But then, okay, so I think that's enough for now. I think the next strategy, I have to determine the next strategy, but maybe the next strategy is to go into the sulci and gyri a bit, because the sulci and gyri, these gyruses, or these folded, like, bulgy parts, the sulci are like the mini fissures between the gyruses, and those, the fact that the brain is folded along sulci and gyri is, in humans, so wrinkly, meaning that is one of the reasons that the brain is so powerful and so cognitively computationally complex, right? Because there's a lot of computation that the brain is not smooth, so you can, like, increase the surface area by folding and crunching the brain in and increase the processing. It's a very basic evolutionary advancement that's done in many other organs as well. So I'm going to cut that here. It was good to talk to you. We will go deeper into our brain studies. I may continue along this path, or I may talk more about the nervous system next time and the different parts of it. We'll see.